The second half of today's video is false friend number 22, overcharge. And right now, I want you to write down what you think overcharge meant in 2 Corinthians 2:5 in the King James Version before we discuss it. Here's the verse. But if any have caused grief, he hath not grieved me, but in part, that I may not overcharge you all. I will pause now to let you write down what it means for Paul to overcharge the Corinthians. And now to the first half of today's video, which is going to be a shout out to one of my favorite critics, someone who is also one of the most faithful watchers of this tiny little humble YouTube channel, and someone whose comments you may have seen underneath some of the videos, Christopher Yetzer. Christopher uses his real name as his handle, so I am not revealing any hidden identities here, though he is most definitely dedicated to the King James Version only, and though he appears to view some of what I'm doing on this channel with alarm, he is the only critic I've had who's actually bothered to interact with me in detail on the ground I've chosen, the current readability of the Elizabethan English of the King James Version. I am not important enough to have many critics, but I've had enough to be impressed with the difference between Christopher and nearly everyone else. Put simply, he's the only critic who sat down to look up many of my proposed false friends in dictionaries and to offer alternative explanations for them. He's a critic who listened hard, and that is a gift, it really is. Christopher and I had a long phone conversation last week, and for my part, I feel like I better understand where he's coming from. Chris thinks I'm trying to misunderstand the King James Version. I'm unnecessarily exaggerating the difficulties in King James English. I understand where he's coming from, in part because I have felt his same feeling at least once while reading a critique of the English Standard Version. It was in an article by a member of the NIV committee, Mark Strauss, who actually authorized the use and misuse of the King James Bible. Strauss's title for this article was actually Why the English Standard Version Should Not Become the Standard English Version. He was mentioning places where he felt that the ESV was overly literal and therefore might cause misunderstandings. One of the examples he brought up was Luke 17:35. In the ESV it says, "There will be two women grinding together. One will be taken and the other left." He said, in contemporary English, grinding together suggests seductive dancing or something worse. Perhaps both should have been taken for judgment. Most versions clarify that this means grinding grain, meal, or flour, and he cites the TNIV, the NIV, the NLT, the HCSB, the NET, NRSV, REB, etc. Now, Mark Strauss is a brilliant guy whose work I have long appreciated. He made another point about literal translation in that very article that rang 100 bells in my head and has helped me immensely over the years. You'll have to read it for yourself to see. But I've written elsewhere that I think Strauss made a misstep with this particular example. Yes, it is just barely possible that a teenager somewhere who hasn't been in church will hear this verse read out loud in the ESV and think of two women doing a sexually suggestive dance. But the context so clearly makes that understanding impossible that it feels kind of like you'd have to really try in order to achieve this misunderstanding. No translation can possibly eliminate all possible misunderstandings by people who aren't trying to understand. This would be sort of like my making a false friends video on the King James word ass. Although I do technically know an absolutely hilarious story of a non-Christian who got tripped up by that word in his very first visit to church when hearing a sermon from the King James on the story of Balaam. The number of speakers of American English who are likely to miss this one in the King James is, I would guess, very small. To make a video about ass would be to set myself up for the criticism that I was just looking for a pretext upon which to criticize the King James Version, that I was trying to misunderstand it, or to make excuses for those who are trying to do so. I can see why Christopher Yetzer feels this way about me. I really can. Now that I know what halt means in the King James at 1 Kings 18:21, how long halt ye between two opinions, I look back on my long-term, decades-long misunderstanding of that false friend, and I wonder, why did it never occur to me that it meant something different than stop there? I can see why someone who all along knew exactly what the King James translators meant by halt here, by the way they meant limp, I can see why someone like that would think I'm just, well, trying to misunderstand. But what can I do except look you in the eyes and ask for your trust? I wasn't trying to misunderstand. Quite the opposite. I've always been the kind of Bible reader who is discontent to get to the end of a verse or a chapter and feel like I didn't grasp it. I was that way when I read the King James Version exclusively, and I'm that way now. And I feel an even greater burden as a preacher and teacher of Scripture to make sure I understand. I have always worked hard to make my language accessible to my audience, too, to get the truth of a given passage across to them, both faithfully and accurately. And there's something else I can say that I think is relevant here. It has to do with the nature of the evidence available when it comes to the question of the readability of King James English. One of the King James only brothers to whom I sent my book before it was published told me he felt that I was putting too much weight on anecdotal evidence. He felt that my own misreadings were being projected onto others, as if it wasn't possible that others were better readers than I. He went on at some length about this, actually trying to undercut completely the value of anecdotal evidence in this debate over King James readability. But I've always wondered, what other evidence do I have access to if I can't use anecdotes? Every misunderstanding that I've ever discovered while reading my Bible is an anecdote. It's a little story. Am I supposed to discount my own experience? I really and truly did fail to understand the King James Version at many places over the years because of dead words and false friends. Yes, it is possible that I was and am simply what pedagogy specialists call a dummy, but even so, I have to say what's true. I have to tell what happened to me. I think what my King James only friend would say is that I have to survey others' experiences, not just rely on my own. And I have done this with one word, halt. I found that the great majority of fellow King James readers were also tripped up by this word. Those 4 of them who were not could all read Hebrew. 3 had PhDs. But what really am I supposed to do beyond that? Doing a formal and statistically reliable study is very difficult, time-consuming, and expensive. I can barely get people to answer a 10-question quiz, let alone a 100-question quiz. Do I have to wait till a broad-based study is done on King James English before I can make a reliable assessment of the King James's current readability? The fact is that, in a way, the dictionary has already done this for me. The nerdy lexicographers at Oxford and Merriam-Webster and American Heritage, etc., have repeatedly marked King James words and individual senses of King James words as archaic or obsolete. And though, like ass and thou and assay, not all of these are hard to figure out from context, I think that the combined testimony of my own experience of misunderstanding and the dictionary's assessment that a given word or sense is obsolete is powerful when taken together. Let me say that one more time a different way. If I come to find that I have misunderstood a word in the King James and the Oxford English Dictionary reveals that that word, sure enough, is archaic or obsolete, I think it's safe for me to conclude that I'm not the only one who's had this particular trouble. And you know, I've listened to other people read the King James Version many times, and I can tell when they stumble. I can tell when their inflection or a certain mispronunciation shows that they don't understand what they're reading. My King James only brothers, including Christopher, tell me that a pastor's job is to explain the King James to those people, and I think there's real truth there. But what do you do when a self-conscious 7th grade girl stumbles while reading the King James in Sunday school class? This has happened to me. It's really hard to correct her without offending or embarrassing her. And the King James is a big book. When exactly am I supposed to get around to explaining to that 7th grade girl what a besom or a collop is? What the best of my critics, such as Christopher Yetzer, tend to want to say next is that, well, of course, the Bible contains difficulties. Am I saying that we should remove every difficult concept from the Bible, that we should put it on a 3rd grade level? No, I am not saying that. I'm saying we shouldn't add unnecessary difficulties that come due to 4 centuries of language change. Then the best of my critics, such as Christopher Yetzer, tend to want to say that the NIV has hard words too, so why am I picking on the King James Version? And this is where we're getting somewhere, because now we can get specific. How many hard words are there in the NIV versus how many there are in the King James Version? Which of them has more? I'm going to have to go out on a limb here and say that I don't even have to count. The King James Version has more hard and obscure words. Multiple King James only organizations have put out lengthy lists of archaic and obsolete words to help people understand the King James. No publisher has ever even thought to do this for the NIV because it isn't necessary. And in any case, what my King James only brothers usually bring out as examples of NIV difficulties are obscure things, not obscure words. Of course, there are place names like the Araba, or plants like mandrakes, or animals like jackdaw, an example given to me by a King James onlyist, that are, yes, obscure. So, yes, the NIV contains difficult words. But there's one kind of difficult word the NIV and ESV don't have. Words that are difficult to understand because of 4+ centuries of language change. I want to acknowledge yet again that not all false friends are false friends to all readers. But I'm doing my best not to make this stuff up. I'm appealing to more than just my experience. I'm appealing to the dictionary, the only access we have to other people's experience. And over again, I've stumbled on a King James word, looked it up in the OED, and discovered that I stumbled because the relevant sense is archaic or obsolete. And now on to the second half of the video, an example of a word that I think is an edge case, a King James word that I think will be a false friend to some readers and not to other more skillful readers. It's the word overcharge. The word shows up in 2 Corinthians 2, where Paul may be talking about the same person he was talking about back in 1 Corinthians 5, namely the guy who had married his stepmother. If that common supposition is correct, and it's a big if, we don't know, Paul told the church to cast this guy out, delivering him to Satan for the destruction of his flesh. But by the time he sends 2 Corinthians, he thinks the punishment has been enough. If any have caused grief, he hath not grieved me, but in part, that I may not overcharge you all. Sufficient to such a man is this punishment, which was inflicted of many, so that contrariwise ye ought rather to forgive him, and comfort him, lest perhaps such a one should be swallowed up with overmuch sorrow. I do think we have a false friend in this paragraph. I think the word overcharge is it. It's not a dead word. We still have this word, but quite clearly, I think, we don't use it the way the King James translators did here. We've got a contextual conflict. Now, this contextual conflict is obvious enough that I think many King James readers, especially experienced ones, will just sort of pick up from context the gist of what Paul means. But for those other readers who will be confused or misled by changes in English, let's go through our process. We've done step 1. We've noticed a possible false friend through contextual conflict. Now let's go on to step 2. Let's look up the Hebrew or Greek word in a responsible original language lexicon. The top Greek-English lexicon, BDAG, says that this word, translated overcharge, means to be a burden to weigh down, burden. And it makes a comment specific to this very passage. It says, 2 Corinthians 2:5 seems to have the meaning in order not to heap up too great a burden of words, in order not to say too much, in other words, although there are no examples of it in this meaning. Other possibilities are exaggerate, be too severe with. Let's go on to step 3. We need to look up overcharge in a contemporary dictionary to discover what it can mean today. Here we get 3 consistent senses. We get the one that is by far the most common, and hence is sense 1. To charge a party an excessive price for something. Sense 1 clearly doesn't fit the Greek word in 2 Corinthians 2:5. Paul is not talking about charging them too much money. But then we get sense 2. To fill too full, overload. That didn't actually sound right to me. I can't think of hearing the word overcharge used this way. But then I saw another dictionary, the New Oxford American Dictionary that comes on every Mac, that gave the example of overcharging a battery. Yes, that I have seen. But overload is awfully close to our Greek word. Is this the sense the King James translators intended? Maybe. Let's keep studying. And then in some dictionaries, but not others, we get a third sense I can't say I've ever heard. To overstate or exaggerate. This third sense maybe could fit the King James context. It's close, but remember how the King James translators word this phrase. In order that I might not overcharge you all. You all is the object of overcharge. Is Paul saying he's not going to overstate them all or exaggerate them all? No, that doesn't make any sense. You can't do those things to people. I want to hold sense 2 in mind as we head to step 4 to see if the Oxford English Dictionary gives us any help. Step 4 is, of course, to look up overcharge in the OED to discover what the word could mean in 1611. And here we run into difficulties and complexities. Now, sense 3 clearly isn't what the King James translators meant. There's nothing about finances or money involved here. Sense 2 also just doesn't work at all. To overpower by superior force, Paul was not saying that's what he was trying not to do. So the KJV translators had to mean something from within sense 1, and I think it has to be sense 1a. To load, fill, or supply to excess with something, to overload, overburden, to overstock, overfill. There's that word overburden. That is a perfect match with our Greek word. This sense is very like that second one in the American Heritage Dictionary, as long as there's no battery or electrical idea required, and the OED does not name this sense as obsolete, as I admit I expected. So, I publicly admit that by my method, the OED does not reveal this word overcharge as a false friend in this context. And I think Christopher Yetzer is therefore justified in saying that I'm being too hard on the King James to make a whole video about this word. He has dictionary support for the continued existence of a relevant sense. Some people out there, according to the dictionary, will read this verse and will understand overcharge to mean overburden. But I've got a problem, and I wonder if you have it. I simply did not know this sense of this word, and even now that I know it, I have a hard time making my brain process overcharge in this context to mean overburden. Again, I just may not be well enough educated. I might have grown up in the wrong region of the English-speaking world. Maybe my Christian school teachers were closet communists or something. Who knows why I have a hard time reading the word this way. But I think most of you are in the same boat. I think the next edition of the Oxford English Dictionary will mark this sense of the word overcharge as obsolete. I do because I think this sense has died. I think only the financial overcharging and the electrical overcharging remain in our English at this precise moment. And so I turn back to a part of step 1 that I didn't use. Because this video is already too long for me to do step 6 and check a linguistic corpus, I'm going to check the English translations of the Bible. And I find that the modern translations go some different ways. A reminder, there's no textual variant here. They're all dealing with the same Greek word. And yet, the New King James Version goes with not to be too severe, which is clearly our English, and the NASB goes with in order not to say too much, which is clearly our English. Those are two of the most common ways for translators to take this phrase. But I checked dozens of contemporary English translations, and not a single one of them goes with overcharge. Why not? Because I think most people here charge too much money in that word. The relevant sense is too rare, approaching, I think, obsolete. I made this video, first half and second half, to acknowledge that there is room for good Christians to disagree about specific questions of King James readability. I made it to express some empathy for a certain class of my critics, a class made up of one person as far as I know, a class that uses my methods and yet comes to a different conclusion. I also made it to teach you the skills you need to evaluate these specific readability questions for yourself. And I want to invite you to make a comment. Let's get some anecdotes. What did you write down when I asked you what overcharge in that context in 2 Corinthians 2 meant to you? Did anyone write down overburden? I'm betting that very few of you did, and I don't blame you. I'm glad I understand this King James word better now, but I also think it's unnecessarily hard and obscure today when we have other good options available in the modern translations. Now, you tell me what you think.